The world's population can essentially be divided into two types of people: those who love the Muppets and those who merely like them. If you're like me, which I can only assume you are, you fall into the first category. But however you feel about Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie, and Walter, whether you think they hit their peak in the 70s, the 90s, the 2010s, or have yet to, one cannot deny the immense effect they've had on pop culture and the legacy that they will forever hold. A legacy that has not come without its drawbacks, delays, and many a cancellation. So today on Retro Ruckus, it's time to play the royalty-free music. It's time to light the non-existent lights. And it's time to meet the Muppet movies and those that never saw the light. Now, unless you've been living under a rock at the swamp your whole life, you know that the Muppets were created by a Mr. Jim Henson. After finding television success locally with Sam and Friends and globally with a little show about a street of some sort, I don't know, I've never seen it, Jim set his sights on his next big project, a primetime variety show that used his Creature Shop creations to cater to all ages. And after a few test attempts in the form of a holiday special and an angsty pilot presentation called Sex and Violence, in September of 1976, The Muppet Show was born.
It's The Muppet Show with our special guest star, Miss Rita Moreno!
Sadly, no one watched it. Alright, obviously I'm kidding, it became a massive hit, and at one point was the most popular television show on the planet. Not an exaggeration. Due to the show's universal humor and lack of human mouths, it was incredibly easy to dub in other languages, leading it to be broadcast in 103 countries. That is more than half of the countries. This was of course a time before DVR or streaming or phones on the toilet. People only had a select number of channels to watch, and needless to say, this made the Muppets the most powerful comedy troupe on Earth. And what do you do when characters become beloved? You sell, baby. Toys, apparel, books, music, cartoons. Name a product or medium, Kermit's cute little face was slapped onto it at some point. And it wasn't long before Hollywood came a-callin' to give movies that same treatment.
Did you say Hollywood?
Read my lips. Hollywood.
The late 70s and early 80s brought us The Muppet Movie, The Great Muppet Caper, and The Muppets Take Manhattan. These musical comedies were not only box office hits, they turned the Muppets into 4-time Oscar nominees and cemented their legacy far beyond television. So one could only assume Jim Henson had a fourth movie lined up and ready to shoot, right? Wrong! Jim Henson was an artist at the top of his game, and he used the Muppets' success to expand his universe with new characters and stories like The Dark Crystal, Fraggle Rock, and Labyrinth. All hail David Bowie. Kermit and the gang continued to appear in television specials and in segments on NBC's Jim Henson Hour, while plans for a fourth movie were developed without too much involvement from Jim himself. What could possibly go wrong?
Failed Projects, Part 1.
Pipe Dream was a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical that premiered on Broadway in 1955, and I promise it will make sense that I'm talking about this in a second. Unlike Rodgers and Hammerstein's smash hit musicals like Cinderella and Oklahoma, this one featured a grittier story about homeless people and sex workers, handled as tastefully as you can imagine a Golden Age musical would. Also, unlike their other musicals, this one flopped hard. Why did it flop? Well, apparently some producer out there had a simple answer. Not enough Muppets, I guess. And so, a film version of the musical starring the Muppets was proposed. The story follows two human characters named Doc and Susie who live in Cannery Row in the 1950s, surrounded by their friends like Mac and Hazel, two squatters, played by Kermit and Fozzie, and Fauna, the madame who runs the cafe across the street, played by, you guessed it, Miss Piggy. In true Golden Age musical fashion, Doc and Susie fall in love, people sing songs about nothing, and then it ends. Now, I think there are two main flaws with this idea. Number one, the music. Rodgers and Hammerstein were arguably the best musical composers of their era, but something that consistently shines in the Muppet movies are the original songs. Heck, it's what they would eventually win an Oscar for. Would Rodgers and Hammerstein's least successful musical live up to Rainbow Connection? I think not. And number 2, there's not enough characters in this musical to give roles to the Muppets, especially with 2 human leads at the forefront. Yes, the Muppets did start featuring human leads in later years, but they were stories with lots of side characters, and stories that were easily recognizable classic works. There's not many Pipe Dream fans out there, and at this time the Muppets fans were used to movies that, well, starred the Muppets. I predict this movie would have disappointed a whole lot of people. And even with the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization urgently pushing this film towards development, presumably still trying to make back the money they lost on the show in 1955, somebody somewhere at Henson had the good sense to say, "No thanks, I'll pass." And alas, the 4th movie was not The Muppets Pipe Dream. The one idea that kind of survived was placing the Muppets in the 50s. A TV show called Muppet High that appeared to be a parody of Grease was developed in the 90s, but ultimately didn't come to fruition either. The cheapest Muppet movie ever made is a script first developed in 1985 by Muppet Show writer Jerry Juhl. As I mentioned earlier, Jim Henson was busy with other projects like Labyrinth, and the budgets were only getting bigger and bigger. While talking to Jerry, Jim mentioned if they made a 4th Muppet movie at that time, it would have to be inexpensive. To compensate for the giant maze sets and all of David Bowie's leather pants. And so the 4th movie was to be the cheapest Muppet movie ever made. Our story begins with Kermit being way too busy to focus on a new Muppet movie. Sound familiar? So he leaves all of the responsibility to Gonzo, who writes a terrible script called Into the Jaws of the Demons of Death. Yeah, about a chase around the world that makes no sense whatsoever. Unfortunately, Gonzo blows half of the movie's budget on the opening credits, so as the movie continues, the budget gets smaller. The same street corner is redecorated to play every major city in the plot. The movie progresses, looking cheaper and cheaper, switching to black and white, then on Super 8 film, until we're just seeing a slideshow of the storyboard. Eventually, Gonzo gains some sort of corporate sponsorship, and the movie ends in high-def widescreen with a budget higher than what they started with, leading to excess spending, like hiring Meryl Streep to be Miss Piggy's stand-in, and a volcanic explosion blowing up an island in the finale. Does that not sound like the best plot you've ever heard? The reason this movie didn't happen is painfully ironic. Jerry Juhl's hilarious script about having no budget became too expensive to shoot at the time. Jim Henson became determined to produce it by 1989, but his budget and attention were forced to focus on other matters. The idea was scrapped until 15 years later in the early 2000s when Frank Oz and writer Jim Lewis rewrote and updated the original script due to Frank's love for the idea. Their new script included the camera operators being Muppet rats with cameras attached to their bodies, and a scene with Miss Piggy that takes place right before her pageant in the original Muppet movie. This version actually got the green light from Disney and was publicly announced to fans at the 2009 D23 Expo, 24 years after the original idea was conceived. Somewhere throughout pre-production, however, a different script altogether ended up taking its place in an effort to reboot the franchise under the Disney banner. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1989, the Walt Disney Company first entered negotiations to acquire Jim Henson Productions and the Muppets as a whole. Before any deal was made, the companies began collaborating on attractions for Disney parks, like Muppet Vision 3D, directed by Jim Henson himself. What no one saw coming is that this project would sadly be Jim's last, before he passed away in 1990, putting the Disney deal, a 4th movie, and the future of the Muppets as a whole on an indefinite hiatus. Enter Jim's son Brian Henson. Determined to continue his father's legacy, he directed 2 new Muppet movies, The Muppet Christmas Carol in 1992 and Muppet Treasure Island in 1996, both co-produced by Walt Disney Pictures. Christmas Carol not only became a fan favorite and holiday classic, it resurged the Muppets in a new style, but with their signature blend of humor and heart. Treasure Island was also received well, but alas, not too well financially. And after 2 seasons of Muppets Tonight on ABC, Disney and Henson parted ways. But not for very long. In the meantime, Sony Pictures came to save the day, offering Jim Henson Pictures a contract to produce between 10 and 15 new movies within 4 to 5 years, with the goal to have possibly 3 of those be new Muppet movies. So the Muppets rushed to develop what would be their new theatrical triumph.
Failed Projects Part 2.
Muppet Robin Hood and Muppets in Camelot both made it to first draft scripts to become feature films. Not much is known about the plots of these adaptations, but one could assume they would follow the same style and beats of the two Muppet movies made with Disney. Brian Henson stated in an interview that they decided there had been too many Robin Hoods, and it's most likely that these didn't move forward in favor of doing something fresher than another Muppet revamp of a classic book. Another example of this was Kermit, Prince of Denmark. Composers Jeff Marks and Bobby Lopez put together a script treatment and 8 original songs for this film idea, without any involvement from the Henson Company itself. Prince of Denmark was set in the same universe as William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and starred, you guessed it, Kermit, who happens to look exactly like Prince Hamlet, and is frequently mistaken for him while traveling through, you guessed it, Denmark. Gonzo and Fozzie play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, while Miss Piggy takes on a dual role as both the lovely Ophelia and the generous Gertrude. Jason Alexander was listed as the ideal actor to play the evil King Claudius. I am not going to recap the plot of Hamlet, as I don't have the patience. This project was made as part of the BMI Workshop, a training ground for composers and playwrights in musical theater. A public reading of the piece was held with longtime Muppeteer Rick Lyon performing Kermit. Jeff Marks and Bobby Lopez were newcomers at the time, and sent their treatment to Brian Henson, who was not at all interested. The young composers moved on and wrote their own project instead, a little musical called Avenue Q, which would win 3 Tony Awards a few years later. Swallow that rejection, kids, you never know what'll come from it. In the early 2000s, Disney was interested in reviving the Prince of Denmark idea. Maybe the Tonys helped pique their interest. But it ultimately was not meant to be. Bobby Lopez did stick around the House of Mouse though, eventually writing the songs for Coco, Winnie the Pooh, and the Frozen movies, so I guess you could say he let it go. Muppet Time Machine is a finished script written by John Duravlani. It's about Dr. Bunsen Honeydew, with the help of his assistant Beaker, inventing time-traveling appliances, which Animal accidentally stumbles into, transporting himself to the Stone Age, where he, naturally, becomes evolution's missing link. Back in the present, Kermit and the gang find themselves living in a world of humans that have descended from Animal, including their friend Postman Joe, played by a celebrity, who now sports Animal's features, voice, attraction to females, and drumming abilities. He plays with the Electric Mayhem on an original song called The World's Gone Animal, which I am very sad doesn't exist. The Muppets and Postman Joe team up to travel back in time to fix things, and chaos ensues. I'm not quite sure this would have been the movie to bring the Muppets back to Hollywood glory, but it is a really fun concept that did show up in some other projects eventually, like the Dave Grohl Animal Hybrid in the 2011 movie, and a 2014 Lipton commercial about animals taking over New York City, which also gave us this. Thank you, Lipton. The Muppets Leave Hollywood came in 1998, when the Henson Company purchased an outside script by an unknown writer. The Muppets play themselves living the high life in Hollywood, which is ironic at this point in their career. Kermit decides they've lost their purpose in this greedy world, and they all head off on an adventure back to his swamp. I'm not sure what they would have done once they got there. That is a lot of Muppets for one swamp. I do find it funny that this plot is literally just the first Muppet movie backwards, and I imagine that was entirely intentional, to remind the audience what we love about the Muppets in the first place. I'm somewhat glad this one didn't happen though, for the risk of it tainting the classic. When Kermit Met Piggy is a parody of the romantic comedy genre and all of its tropes, specifically movies like 4 Weddings and a Funeral and When Harry Met Sally. While that seems like a tired joke now, the 90s were the height of rom-coms. Nora Ephron reigned box office supreme, and the idea of satirizing the genre was a pretty fresh take, especially with the Muppets. Written by Jim Lewis, the story is from the perspective of Miss Piggy, retelling how her and Kermit fell in love, exactly how she claims to recall it. In the fashion of ensemble rom-coms like Love Actually, we also get B-plot stories from other Muppet couples like Gonzo and Camilla and Rizzo and Yolanda. Beautiful. In a recent interview, Jim Lewis stated that the project had been moving along quite nicely, and it was ultimately just poor timing that it didn't come to be. I am sad about this one. The next Muppet movie, that's what it's called, was written by screenwriter Brian Lynch, who would later go on to write for movies like Puss in Boots, Minions, and Secret Life of Pets. With the script sometimes also referred to as When Muppets Attack, the story takes place in the same universe as the Muppet movie and follows Kermit as he struggles to save the Muppet Theater from a Hollywood producer named Mick, who begins luring each of the Muppets away into their own solo careers. Animal becomes a famous rapper, Miss Piggy gets her own talk show, and Gonzo becomes the next James Bond and Batman. Kermit is forced to pull together a new group of lesser-known Muppets to restart the Muppet Show, including Rizzo, Pepe, Robin, Bean Bunny, Digit, and Pierce Brosnan, auditioning after losing his James Bond gig to Gonzo. Eventually, Kermit figures out Mick has evil ulterior motives, confronts him, gets kidnapped, and both the popular and unpopular Muppets team up to save Kermit. The big finale of the film involves, quote, a lot of ninjas, a giant elephant, a 7-foot Kermit, and Gonzo saving the day by crashing through the skylight in his Batman gear. Wow. Leading to a happy ending for the Muppets, while Mick remains unchanged and gets dropped off by a taxi ready to break up another group. He walks off and the camera pans out to reveal that he is on Sesame Street. And Finn. The script called for lots of Hollywood spoofs and cameos from Mr. Rogers, John Cleese, Marilyn Manson, the Teletubbies, Jon Stewart, Mary Tyler Moore, the entire cast of Sesame Street, the aforementioned Pierce Brosnan, and possibly Michael Keaton as Mick the evil producer. As incredible as this movie sounds, its fate is bittersweet, as if this one had happened, it's unlikely we would have gotten the 2011 movie with a somewhat similar plot. Take that as you will. A Halloween movie of some kind had long been attempted throughout the Muppets' history. Pre-production on a Halloween special started in 1991, which ended up turning into a Christmas Carol TV special, which ended up turning into a full-on movie. In 1996, Brian Henson announced that they were discussing ideas for a Muppet Monster horror parody feature film. That turned into two different scripts, one written by Dan Milano and the other by Joey Mazzarino, both titled The Muppets Haunted Hotel. No information is known about these scripts, but solid plans were forming to produce the movie, and the Henson Company even purchased the domain name MuppetHauntedHotel.com. Some press reported that the film would come out in fall 2000, which never happened. A few years later, a new script called Muppet Haunted House was written by Kirk Thatcher and Jim Lewis. The plot involved the Muppets joining Dr. Bunsen Honeydew on a vacation to an old creepy castle to hear the reading of his uncle's will. Okay. Eventually, though, the castle's evil energy begins to transform our beloved Muppets into monsters. Gonzo turns into the vampire Nosferatu, Fozzie turns into a Waka Waka werebear, Clifford turns into a muck monster, Kermit turns into Kermonster, Miss Piggy, the ghoul friend of Kermonster, and Dr. Honeydew's uncle resembles the Phantom of the Opera. In the end, it all turns out to be a bad dream in the mind of Kermit's nephew, Robin. Or was it? Despite this movie almost being made several times, the only proof of concept we actually ended up getting was a PlayStation video game called Muppet Monster Adventure. Years later, Disney once again announced a Halloween special in 2010, but decided to cancel it to add weight to their 2011 comeback. And it wasn't until 2021 that the Muppets finally celebrated Halloween on our screens. And finally, there was Muppets in Space. I know what you're thinking, that one happened. On the contrary, my friend, Muppets from Space happened. Development of a science fiction Muppets movie turned into two completely different scripts. Star Gonzo by Jerry Juhl and Muppets in Space by Kirk Thatcher. Kirk's script was about Kermit being kidnapped, that happens a lot, but this time by aliens after being mistaken for the long-lost leader of their civilization. The rest of the Muppets then don their spacesuits and set out across the universe to save him like the natural space travelers they are. This movie was announced as their first film for the new Sony deal, described as a stylistic parody of the Star Wars universe. However, second thoughts were had, and they decided to go with Jerry Juhl's script instead, Star Gonzo, eventually renamed Muppets from Space. Jerry once remarked, "I hope someday Kirk's movie gets made, because it is really funny." So the Muppet shenanigans return to the big screen, with the Muppets Haunted Hotel and the next Muppet movie slated to be the follow-ups. But then...
I know where I come from! I'm from outer space! You look No, Rizzo, I'm just fine.
Muppets from Space was a critical and commercial failure, therefore canceling any development on all of those movies that I just talked about for a long time. The late 90s and early 2000s were an incredibly bizarre time for our felty friends. It seemed as though their heyday was perhaps set in stone at this point. They carried on with smaller productions like It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie on NBC and the straight-to-DVD origin story Kermit's Swamp Years, which we don't need to talk about. Until 2004, when the Disney deal finally took place, acquiring the Muppets IP, forming a new division of Disney called the Muppet Studio, and removing the Henson Company from all creative control. Disney has not always known what to do with the Muppets' legacy. A lot of pressure was on at this time to properly give the Muppets the comeback they so needed. Which brings us to...
Failed Projects, Part 3.
Kirk Thatcher and Jim Lewis reunited to pitch a Muppets beach blanket movie in the style of 60s musical romps like Beach Party. As fun as this sounds, it might not have been the movie to save the Muppets. It does, however, exist in the form of a hilarious album. Yes, this is real. Muppets 1776 is a spoof of American history, with characters like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson being played by Muppets like Kermit, Fozzie, and Sam the Eagle. Hot take, but I don't think this one needed to be made. A similar concept became the short-lived Disney World show, The Muppets Present Great Moments in American History. Superhero movies had a huge resurgence in the early 2000s with movies like Spider-Man and X-Men, which brought writer Craig Shemin to pitch The Muppets Save the World. When the Muppets are driving home from the movies in the Electric Mayhem van, they accidentally cruise through a radiation storm, all receiving superpowers like flight, invisibility, and super strength. Gonzo gets the ability to shapeshift, but only into something he'd just seen. Because they had all just watched a Matt Damon movie, he spends half of the movie as Matt Damon. In a recent interview, Craig Shemin pitched that Marvel could use this concept to produce an episode of What If, where the Muppets are the Marvel superheroes, such as Kermit as the Hulk. Other movies listed in development for Disney at this time were Mission Improbable, a spy spoof by Andy Bernstein, an origin movie for Animal by Rafe Beck, a Muppets Las Vegas Adventure by Bill Beretta, as well as Muppet Time Machine, Muppet Haunted House, When Kermit Met Piggy, the next Muppet movie, Muppet Camelot, Muppet Robin Hood, and the cheapest Muppet movie ever made, all still in development. So what did Disney choose over all of these concepts to bring the Muppets back to the screen? The answer is sickening.
Are you sure there isn't anything else I could do you for?
No. You see, I already have a girlfriend. She's a chicken.
Oh. A chicken, eh?
Yeah.
Like this?
The Muppets Wizard of Oz aired on ABC in 2005. Yeah. A few years later, they returned to NBC with another holiday movie that I unashamedly adore, A Muppet's Christmas, Letters to Santa. But finally, they made their proper comeback to the movies in 2011, with the Jason Segel and Flight of the Conchords-led film, simply called The Muppets. This was the most successful Muppet movie in history, winning an Oscar and propelling our heroes into the spotlight where they belong. The Muppets were back, baby, and it seemed they were here to stay. Until a few years later, when Muppets Most Wanted was only moderately successful, and they haven't returned to the big screen ever since. History repeats itself, folks. In 2015, Disney swung Kermit and the gang right back to where they started, television, with the ABC series confusingly also called The Muppets. An adult-oriented mockumentary in the style of The Office, the show was beloved by Muppet fans and not watched by anyone else. And so began another 5 years of the Muppets not having much to do. When Disney Plus was announced in 2019, pre-production began on a reboot limited series called Muppets Live Another Day, developed by Josh Gad and the creators of Once Upon a Time, Adam Horowitz and Eddie Kitsis, directed by Jason Moore of Pitch Perfect fame, with songs by Kristen and Bobby Lopez. Remember him? He's back. The show was to take place in the 80s, right after the events of the original 3 movies, re-establishing all of the nostalgia that these characters hold for us. But after creative differences emerged, the project was abandoned for a borderline web series called Muppets Now. It's fine. Disney Plus did still bring something super important to the Muppets' legacy, though. For the first time in history, it has never been easier to find Kermit and the gang all in one place. Their wacky antics and heartfelt display of friendship has lasted through multiple generations at this point, from comedy fans in the 70s to preschoolers watching Disney Junior this morning. As a fan, I used to be concerned about the future of the Muppets, and honestly I was right up until I made this video. Because it showed me that uncertainty around these guys is not new. Time and time again, no matter how many abrupt cancellations and quiet periods they've gone through, these characters always find a way to come back to our screens. They are relentless little guys. Whether they ever get the big screen treatment again or not, projects like Muppets Haunted Mansion or this year's Muppets Mayhem series on Disney Plus have shown us that they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think Jim Henson would be proud to know that no matter how much time passes, the Muppets will write their own ending.